The smell hit first. Rust. Wet concrete. Something chemical underneath, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. Kalian's sneakers squeaked against the floor as he moved fast through the underground corridor. Low ceiling. Flickering yellow light. The kind of place that didn't want to be looked at too long. His small fists came down against the cage bars. Once, twice, 3 times. Hard enough that his knuckles split red at the edges. No sound came out of his mouth. Never did. But his whole body was a scream. Every muscle pulled tight. Every breath coming in short, violent bursts through his nose. "Hey! Somebody get the kid!" One of the guards glanced over from his post near the east corridor. Didn't move. Just looked. Another guard shrugged. "He's fine. He does that. Like it was nothing. Like a 10-year-old boy slamming his broken hands against steel bars in an underground facility was just a Tuesday habit they'd all learned to walk around. The dog inside the cage hadn't moved. Massive. A pit bull with a broad, scarred head and a body that had been through things no body should go through. His coat was brown and white, dulled by grime. Both ears were torn at the edges. 3 long scars ran diagonal across his left shoulder. Old ones, faded but deep. His eyes were open, just barely, aimed at the floor. Not sleeping, not alert, just existing in that particular way living things do when they've stopped expecting anything good. A red tag hung on the cage latch. Block letters, black ink, printed on a laminated card like it was a grocery label. Unstable. Termination scheduled. Kalian read it 3 times. Then his body started shaking. Not from cold. The facility was actually warm, too warm. Recycled air pumped through old vents. He shook because something was tearing open inside his chest and he had no way to let it out. No scream. No words. No sound at all. His throat worked. Muscles contracted. Nothing. Just silence. The way it always was. A woman in blue scrubs walked past, clipboard under her arm, shoes clicking efficiently against the floor. She glanced at Kalian the way you glance at a potted plant. Acknowledged, unimportant. "We're running the evening schedule at 9, she said to no one in particular. "Make sure Bay 7 is cleared." Bay 7. Kalian looked at the number above the cage. 7. His hands stopped hitting the bars. He pressed his palms flat against the metal instead. Just held them there. His forehead dropped forward and rested against the cold steel between his hands. He breathed. In. Slow, even though his chest didn't want slow. Hi viewers. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you were standing right in front of someone? The dog's head lifted. Just slightly. An inch, maybe 2. Those dull eyes moved. Not fast, not sharp. Just enough to find Kalian's face through the bars. They stayed there. Boy and dog, forehead to cage, eyes meeting in the worst possible place at the worst possible hour. And then Kalian saw it again. The red tag. Termination scheduled. Tonight. Nobody in the Vire household noticed when Kalian left. That should have been the first warning. Should have been the kind of thing that got flagged, questioned, tracked, the kind of absence that triggered a whole security response. Didn't. He slipped out the side entrance of the east wing at 6:30, the way he always did. Through the kitchen corridor, past the garage where 2 black SUVs sat idle, out the service gate that only closed all the way if you kicked it twice. He'd been doing it for 3 weeks. Nobody noticed. That fact sat in the air of the Vire estate the way a lot of uncomfortable facts did. Acknowledged by no one, felt by everyone. The Vire estate sat on 11 acres outside the city. Gated. Manicured. The kind of property that said power without needing a sign. Inside, every room was designed with purpose. Dark wood. High ceilings. Art that cost more than most people's houses. Security cameras in every hallway. Motion sensors on every perimeter. A staff of 14. And somehow, A 10-year-old mute boy walked out 6 nights in a row. Kalian Vire was the youngest of the household. Not a biological son. A ward, a term the Vire brothers used when paperwork required it, though none of them were comfortable saying it out loud. He'd come to them at age 7 under circumstances none of the staff ever fully understood. The brothers didn't explain. The staff didn't ask. What they knew, he didn't speak. He never had. He communicated through expression, through gesture, through the particular way he'd stand in a doorway and look at a person until they felt the weight of whatever he needed to say. Some of the staff found it unsettling. Most just found it inconvenient, because silence, when it's consistent enough, becomes easy to ignore. Zevran Vire was the oldest by 4 minutes. Broad-shouldered, built like a man who settled arguments with his presence before his voice ever needed to arrive. He ran operations, numbers, territory, enforcement. He spoke in directives and moved like every room already belonged to him. He'd look at Kalian sometimes. Really look, the way you look at something you're trying to read, and then something would shift in his expression and he'd look away. Cedric Vire was the strategist. The one who planned 3 moves ahead, who could sit through a negotiation for 5 hours and never show discomfort. He was the one who'd originally arranged Kalian's security protocol, assigned his tutors, made sure the dietary requirements were logged with the kitchen. Organized, efficient, perfectly structured care with no warmth attached to it. Nairos Vire was the third, the quiet one. Not quiet the way Kalian was quiet. Nairos had full use of his voice, he just chose not to use it unless necessary. Cold was the word people reached for. Still, he watched people the way cameras watch rooms, without expression, without engagement, catching everything. He was the only one of the 3 brothers who had, even once, stopped in a hallway when Kalian was standing there. Just stopped. Looked at him, then kept walking. It wasn't warmth, but it was something. The mansion had every luxury a child could want. A gaming room, a library stocked by a professional curator, a pool, private grounds. Kalian had access to all of it. What he didn't have was anyone who sat still long enough to understand what he was trying to say. So he started leaving. 3 weeks ago, he'd followed a delivery truck that used the service entrance. Purely by accident, purely because he was bored and restless and the truck had a dent in its rear panel shaped like a lightning bolt and he'd been curious. The truck had stopped 2 miles from the estate, at a low gray building tucked behind an industrial block. No sign above the door, just a buzzer and a camera. He'd come back the next day, and the day after that. And on the 4th day, he'd slipped inside when a worker left the side door propped open. That was when he found the corridor. That was when he found Bay 7. Nobody at the estate knew where he went in the evenings. Not Zevran, not Cedric, and not Nairos, who had, on the 3rd night, noticed the boy was gone, and said nothing. The building called itself Eastgate Animal Recovery Services. That was what the registration said, anyway. Filed with the city 3 years ago. Non-profit status. A mission statement about compassionate animal welfare and community rehoming initiatives. A website with stock photos of smiling volunteers holding golden retrievers. None of it was real. What was real? The underground level, accessible only through a door coded behind a supply shelf in the back storage room. What was real? The rows of cages down there, sorted not by animal type or size but by category. A category system nobody who ran the place ever wrote down, because some things stay operational by staying unwritten. Category 1. Valuable. These were animals with verifiable breed documentation, trained for specific purposes, or with buyers already lined up. They were fed twice a day, kept clean, handled carefully. Category 2. Pending. Animals with potential. Might sell. Might not. Kept alive while the math worked out. Category 3. Disposable. These were the ones in the back corridor. Bay 7 through Bay 12. Brutus had been Category 1 once. 4 years ago he was a machine, fast, relentless, built for the circuit. The people who ran him made real money. He won 15 consecutive matches in the underground fight network operating out of 3 different cities. They'd fed him well, trained him hard. His handler at the time, a man named Dontrell, had actually been decent to him in the hours between, letting him rest, keeping his wounds clean, talking to him in a low voice before sleep. Then Dontrell disappeared. New handler. Different approach. Brutus started losing. Not because he got slower. Because something in him had gone quiet. Like a light that dims so gradually you don't notice until the room is already dark. He stopped responding to commands with the same snap. Stopped engaging with the same intensity. His eyes went from sharp to flat. The circuit didn't tolerate flat. 2 losses in a row and he was sold. 3rd-tier buyer. Used briefly for something else. Kalian didn't know what, would never know. And then transferred to Eastgate when the buyer couldn't move him. Nobody wanted a fight dog who wouldn't fight. The facility manager, a man named Gerald Osei, ran the operation with careful, methodical efficiency. He was not a cruel man by the standard definition. He didn't enjoy what happened to Category 3 animals. He just didn't let his feelings enter the room when decisions were made. Sentimentality is a budget problem, he told a new staffer once, without irony. The evening schedule ran at 9 o'clock. That was when the veterinary tech came in to administer. Clean, quick, documented. Gerald kept records. He was organized about it. Kalian had learned the schedule on his 5th visit. He'd overheard 2 staff members talking in the hallway above, their voices carrying easily down through the ventilation gap near Bay 10. 9 o'clock sharp. Gerald doesn't like to run late. And then laughter, easy and relaxed, the laughter of people who had made peace with routine. This is how cruelty survives. Not through evil people. Through efficient systems. Through schedules. Through paperwork. Through rooms where no one looks too long. Kalian pressed himself flat against the wall when a staff member walked through the corridor with a push cart. He was small enough and still enough that he blended into the shadow between 2 support columns. The worker didn't look. Why would he look? The only people who came down here were staff. Not silent 10-year-old boys who'd learned 3 weeks ago that the side door stayed propped from 6:45 to 7:20 every evening when the shift changed. Brutus hadn't moved from his position in the corner of Bay 7. But when Kalian crouched down in front of the cage, those flat eyes traveled. Slowly. Found his face. Stayed. Kalian pulled his knees to his chest and sat on the cold concrete floor and just looked back. His eyes were warm. Dark brown, very wide. The kind of eyes that held everything they felt right on the surface with nowhere to hide it. He raised one hand. Pressed it flat against the bars. The cage was cold. The metal smelled like rust and disinfectant. Brutus looked at the hand. Didn't move. Didn't growl. Just looked. Somewhere above them, a door opened. Voices, 2 of them male, discussing the 9 o'clock schedule. Kalian's eyes went to the red tag on the latch. Tonight. And then slowly, painfully, like something moving for the first time after a long freeze, Brutus pushed himself up from the floor. One front leg, then the other. His back legs followed. His whole body trembled with the effort. He crossed the 4 feet of cage floor and reached the bars. The paw came through the gap between the bars, low and slow. Not aggressive. Not testing. Just extended. Offered, the way you'd hold out your hand across a table to someone you weren't sure would take it. Kalian didn't move. He stayed exactly as he was. Crouched low, hand flat against the bars, barely breathing. The paw touched his hand. That was all. Just rested there. Heavy and rough and warm. 3 of Brutus' nails were cracked. The pads were calloused in a way that shouldn't happen to a dog that age. Kalian could feel every hard ridge of scar tissue across the top of the paw, roads of old pain mapped in raised skin. Something broke open in Kalian's chest. Not sadness exactly. something older and quieter than sadness. The feeling of being seen, of recognizing in another living thing the specific texture of your own kind of hurt. He turned his hand over slowly, opened his palm. The paw stayed. Brutus lowered his massive scarred head until his chin rested against the bar directly above Kalian's hand. His eyes were closed, not sleeping, just resting. Like proximity to this particular person was the first restful thing that had happened in a long time. Kalian's throat tightened. He pressed his free hand to his own chest. Pressed hard, the way he always did when something was too large to hold without anchoring himself. Neither of them moved for a long time. The corridor was quiet, ventilation humming, the faint drip of water somewhere down the hall. Faint footsteps 2 levels up, muffled and distant. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him. Nairo's Vire moved without sound when he chose to. It was a skill he'd cultivated deliberately. The ability to occupy a space without announcing himself, to watch without being watched. He'd followed Kalian 3 nights ago, tracking the boy's exit with a detachment that told himself he was simply closing a security gap. Someone needed to know where the child went. He hadn't intervened. He'd come back the next night, and the night after, and now he stood at the far end of the corridor 20 feet back, in the shadow where the yellow lighting didn't reach. His arms were crossed loosely. His face was completely still. He watched the boy's hand cradled in the dog's paw. He watched the way Kalian's whole body had gone soft. Every line of tension that normally lived in the child's frame just dissolved. Like the dog's touch had unlocked something that no amount of security, no amount of luxury, no tutoring schedule or gated estate had ever reached. Something shifted in Nairo's chest. Not much. He wouldn't have named it if asked. He was not in the habit of naming things that happened in his chest. But it moved, unmistakably. He watched for another 2 minutes. Then, very quietly, almost to himself, so quietly he might have been speaking to no one, Nairo said, "Why him?" Not a command. Not even really a question. More like something that slipped out when the guard dropped. Kalian didn't hear it. Brutus' ears moved. One rotation toward the sound, then back. Like the dog had heard, waited, and decided it wasn't a threat. Nairo stayed where he was. The 9 o'clock schedule had been mentioned on the documents he'd pulled from facility intake records yesterday. He'd had his assistant run the building for reasons that had nothing to do with Kalian, coincidentally, and the records had simply been there. He'd read them. He understood what the red tag meant. He also understood what was going to happen if he did nothing. His jaw tightened. A crack. Just a hairline fracture. In the particular cold composure he'd spent 20 years building into architecture. He looked at his younger brother's small back, at the dog whose paw rested in his hand, and he did not walk away. Gerald Osei checked his watch at 8:41 and decided to run the schedule early. He had a dinner reservation at 10. The restaurant was 40 minutes from the facility and Gerald was not, under any circumstances, a man who arrived anywhere late. It was a personal rule. The same personal rule that kept his logs clean, his schedules consistent, his operation invisible. "Move Bay 7 to 8:55, he said to the tech without looking up from his desk. "We'll run the full corridor sequence and be done by 9:15. The tech, a young man named Perry who had learned not to ask questions, nodded and started gathering supplies. Down in the corridor, Kalian felt it before he heard it. A shift in the air. Heavier footsteps than usual, moving with purpose. The rattle of a cart with medical equipment. Perry's footsteps had a specific cadence. Brisk, task-focused, and Kalian had learned it over the past 3 weeks without realizing he'd learned it. His head came up. Brutus' eyes opened. The paw didn't lift. It stayed. But the dog's body shifted. Weight moving to his back legs. Tension rising slowly through his shoulders like something instinctive and very old was waking up behind his flat eyes. Kalian looked at the red tag. He looked at the corridor mouth, the turn where Perry would appear in approximately 45 seconds. He looked at Brutus. His breathing changed. Short, fast, his whole ribcage working hard. He tried to think, tried to form a plan. Anything, any sequence of actions that connected what he wanted to what he was capable of doing. But panic doesn't think in sequences. Panic thinks in images. And the image his mind kept returning to was the red tag, and Perry's cart, and the way Brutus had lifted his paw like it was the most difficult thing he'd ever done. He needed to say something. To someone. Anyone. The words lined up inside him. He could feel them, could feel the exact shape of what he needed to communicate, the urgency, the specifics. He knew exactly what to say. He had always known exactly what to say. His throat locked. Muscles contracted against nothing. The sound that would have been a shout dissolved somewhere between his lungs and his lips. Nothing came out. The cart's wheels hit the corridor floor. Perry turned the corner, clipboard tucked under his arm, and stopped. Kalian was standing now, directly in front of Bay 7, both hands flat against the cage, facing Perry with the most precise expression of refusal a 10-year-old boy had ever managed without words. His chin was up. His feet were planted. His eyes were direct and devastating. Perry blinked. He looked at the boy, looked at the dog, looked at the red tag still hanging on the latch. He looked back at the boy. "Kid, you're not supposed to be down here." Kalian shook his head. "I need you to step aside." Kalian shook his head again. Harder. "The animal on the schedule." Perry started, and something in Kalian's expression shifted so fast, so completely, that Perry actually stopped talking. It wasn't aggression. It was the opposite. Raw desperation with nowhere to go. Kalian's hands moved to the cage latch. Perry's eyes went wide. "Hey, don't. Systems don't pause for feelings. Especially not silent ones." Kalian's fingers found the key hanging on a small hook inside the latch housing, where staff always left it, because who was going to steal it? The dogs? And he pulled it free. Perry dropped the clipboard. "Stop. That dog is unstable. You don't understand." Kalian pushed the key into the lock. Turned it. The latch released. "Which part hit hardest for you so far?" Kalian's silence, Nairo's watching from the shadows, or the moment Brutus first lifted his paw? The alarm didn't build. It exploded. 1 second silence. The next, a screaming wall of sound that bounced off every metal surface in the corridor and came back twice as loud. Red emergency lights kicked on along the ceiling, washing everything in a color that looked exactly like what it was. Danger. Perry stumbled backward. His cart hit the wall. Equipment rattled, slid, crashed to the floor. Lockdown. Bay 7. Someone get Gerald down here now. His voice was swallowed by the alarm. Kalian stood at the open cage door. He hadn't moved, hadn't run, just stood there, one hand still on the door, eyes locked on Brutus. The dog was on his feet, all the way up, no trembling now. His head was level with his shoulders, ears forward, body filling the space the cage had spent months compressing him into. The alarm didn't make him flinch. The red lights didn't scatter him. He stood in the open doorway of Bay 7 like he was deciding something. Footsteps. Fast, heavy, from the upper corridor. 2 sets. Then 3. The first guard came around the corner with one hand on his radio and the other reaching toward his belt. He saw the open cage. He saw the dog standing in the opening. His hand moved to his belt faster. Back up. Back up right now. A second guard arrived behind him. Then Gerald Osei himself, jacket half on, dinner reservation and organized schedules temporarily suspended by the fact that something in his underground facility had departed from the plan. Gerald looked at the open cage, looked at Kalian, looked at Brutus. His expression went through several changes in a short window of time. That animal is a Category 3, Gerald said. His voice was flat, not panicked. He didn't do panicked. It has an active termination order. Whoever opened that cage. He stopped, because Brutus stepped out. One front paw on the concrete corridor floor, then the other. Then his full weight shifted forward and he was standing completely outside Bay 7 for the first time in 4 months. His head moved slowly, scanning. Every person in the corridor registered in those eyes one at a time. The first guard had his hand fully on his weapon now. "Do not move," he said to the dog. Brutus looked at him. The guard's hand tightened. Perry had flattened himself against the far wall. He was not getting paid enough for this. He was aware of that clearly. The alarm kept screaming. Everyone in that corridor was waiting for the same thing. Teeth. A lunge. The violent proof of everything written on that red tag. Brutus turned his head, found Kalian, and walked toward him. Not fast. Not slow. Deliberately. The way something moves when it has already made up its mind and the opinions of everyone in the room are simply not the deciding factor. He stopped directly beside Kalian. Sat down. His shoulder pressed against Kalian's hip. Warm. Heavy. Present. The dog's breathing was steady. His eyes tracked the guard with the weapon, not aggressive, just aware. Like he was watching, not threatening. The corridor went strange. Not quiet, the alarm was still going. But the quality of the air changed. The guard's hand didn't move. Gerald didn't move. Perry had stopped breathing. Because what they were looking at didn't match the story the red tag had been telling for 4 months. Kalian's hand came down slowly, rested on Brutus' head. The dog leaned into it. Gerald. The voice came from the back of the corridor. Everyone turned. Nairos Vire stood at the corridor entrance. He hadn't rushed. His jacket was on properly. His expression was the same expression he wore in boardrooms and interrogation rooms and every other room where he needed to be the thing that didn't move. "Call it off," Nairos said. Gerald opened his mouth. Nairos looked at him. Gerald closed it. One of the guards reached for the alarm panel on the wall. Silence dropped over the corridor like a physical weight. And in that silence, for just a moment, everyone heard the same thing. Kalian. Breathing. Slow and even. His hand on Brutus' head. The dog perfectly still beside him. Two beings that had already decided. Before anyone else in the room caught up. Nobody moved first. That was the thing. In rooms full of powerful, trained, armed people, the usual order is that somebody takes charge inside the first 10 seconds. That's what training is for. That's what protocol exists to guarantee. But nobody in that corridor moved. They all just stood there looking at a massive scarred dog sitting calmly beside a silent 10-year-old boy. And something in the picture short-circuited the part of the brain that knew what to do next. Gerald was the first to recover. Because Gerald was built for recovery. "Mr. Vire," he said carefully. "With respect, the animal has a legal termination order. The paperwork is complete. If we don't follow through, the facility's compliance record." "Gerald." Nairos said his name once. Gerald stopped. "Compliance record." Nairos repeated it. Not a question. Not quite contempt either. Just the words held up in the air so everyone could look at what they actually meant in this particular room, in this particular facility, with the particular nature of the operations running 3 levels above them. Gerald understood. He pressed his lips together, nodded once. "The order is cancelled," Gerald said to Perry. Perry wrote it down. He didn't know what else to do. One of the guards, the one whose hand had been on his weapon, finally dropped his arm to his side. He looked at Brutus one more time. The dog looked back. Then the guard looked somewhere else and kept it there. Nairos walked forward. Not toward Kalian. Not yet. He stopped about 6 feet away, at the precise distance that was close enough to be present and far enough to not be intrusive. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, an unusual posture for him. No crossed arms. No controlled stillness. Just standing. He looked at his brother. Kalian felt the presence before he saw it. He turned his head slowly. Found Nairos. There was a long moment where neither of them did anything. Kalian's eyes went to Nairos' face and stayed. Searching. The way he always searched faces. Not for words but for the thing underneath words. The real thing. The one people couldn't hide if you looked long enough and knew what to look for. What he found in Nairos' face was unexpected. Not warmth. Not comfort. Nothing performed. Just attention. Real, unguarded, undivided attention. The kind that costs something to give. Kalian's jaw worked. He looked down at Brutus, then back at Nairos. He put his hand to his chest. Then he pointed to the dog. It wasn't a complex sentence. It wasn't elaborate. But the meaning was completely clear. The way he held his hand over his heart before pointing was the kind of thing you understood in your chest before your brain finished processing it. This one is mine. Nairos looked at the dog. Brutus had not moved. He sat with the weight of his shoulder still against Kalian's hip. His eyes on Nairos now, steady and unbothered. Something crossed Nairos' face. Very fast. There and gone. If anyone else in the corridor had been watching him instead of the dog, they might have caught it. He raised his hand. The room went tight. Every person in that corridor reading the gesture and waiting to understand what it meant. Was it a signal to the guards? An order? The end of whatever this was? Nairos' hand stayed raised for exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, "He comes home with us tonight." Zevran Vire found out at midnight. He was in the East Study, 3 open folders on the desk, a call to the Chicago operation scheduled in 12 minutes, when his phone rang with Nairos' name on it. He picked up without looking away from the folders. "Talk." Nairos talked. Zevran put down his pen at the 45-second mark. By the time Nairos finished, Zevran was standing. "You canceled a termination order on a fight dog." He said it the way he said things that required confirmation before he could process them fully. "Yes. And brought it into the estate. He's in the East Wing. Separate room monitored. Because Kalian." "Yes." A long pause. The kind Zevran used when he was calculating something that went beyond numbers. "I'll call you back," he said, and hung up. He didn't call Nairos back. He walked through the estate instead. West corridor to the East Wing, which was a longer route than necessary, which meant he was thinking hard enough to need the extra time. He passed the kitchen, past the security room, past the gallery hallway where 12 different pieces of art hung that cost more than some people's cars, and he stopped in front of the closed door at the end of the East corridor and stood there for a moment. Then he opened it. Kalian was asleep on the floor, not in the bed. The bed was there, untouched, sheets still tucked. Kalian was on the floor beside it, knees pulled up, one arm stretched out. And Brutus was beside him. The dog's body curved around the boys like a wall, like something that had decided its one job in the world was to be a barrier between this child and everything else. Zevran stood in the doorway. He was a large man who had built his entire life around the certainty that he understood power. He could read rooms. He could read people. He had spent 20 years learning how every kind of strength operated and where its edges were. He stood in the doorway of that room and looked at his youngest brother sleeping on the floor beside a scarred dog that nobody wanted, and something shifted in him that he didn't have a clean name for. He closed the door quietly. Cedric was waiting in the hallway. Of course he was. Cedric had heard about the situation at 11:15 and had spent the intervening time compiling relevant information, because that was how Cedric handled things that caught him off guard. "The animal has a documented aggression history," Cedric said. "Not an accusation. Just information. 3 recorded incidents in the circuit, 2 in custody. Gerald's records show. Gerald runs a front operation through city permits," Zevran said. "His records are whatever he needed them to be." Cedric paused. "Fair. I want an independent evaluation. Veterinary behaviorist. Not Gerald's people. I'll arrange it in the morning. They stood in the hallway outside the closed door. Zevran looked at the door for a moment. When's the last time he slept like that? Cedric understood what he meant. When's the last time Kalian slept without the restless movement that the night staff had logged in their monitoring reports? Without the waking at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Without the look on his face in the mornings that said sleep hadn't actually helped. Cedric checked the monitoring data on his phone. Looked up. I don't have a comparable data point, he said. I've never seen this on the monitor before. Zevran nodded. They stood there a moment longer. Real power isn't control, Nairos said from the end of the hallway. Both brothers turned. Nairos had appeared without either of them noticing, the way he did. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his face doing almost nothing, looking at the closed door. It's knowing when to stop, he finished. Neither Zevran nor Cedric answered, because there wasn't anything to argue with. And in the morning, in a meeting that ran 2.5 hours and covered risk, liability, behavioral assessment, and the operational complications of having an unknown animal in a secured estate, Zevran sat at the head of the table, listened to everything, and then said, "He stays." Cedric nodded once. Nairos across the table said nothing. He didn't need to. That matters. Because what happened next, what Zevran and Cedric didn't know yet, what Nairos was only beginning to understand, was going to change the estate in ways none of them had planned for. The behaviorist's name was Dr. Yolanda Achebe. She drove out to the Vire estate on a Thursday morning with 2 colleagues, an equipment case, and the professional composure of someone who had spent 18 years evaluating animals that humans had already decided were lost causes. She spent 4 hours with Brutus, not in a clinical room, in the estate's east courtyard, which Cedric had cleared and prepared with the particular thoroughness he applied to everything. Dr. Achebe moved through a structured assessment. Proximity responses, sound sensitivity, handler interaction, stranger response, and she took notes throughout in a way that revealed nothing about her conclusions until she was ready to give them. Zevran sat in on the last hour, arms crossed, back against the far courtyard wall, watching. At the end, Dr. Achebe sat down across from Zevran at the courtyard table, set her notes in front of her, and said, "This dog is not aggressive." Zevran waited. "He is shut down. There's a difference." She tapped her pen against the table once. An aggressive animal looks for confrontation. This animal is avoiding it, has been avoiding it based on his behavioral markers for a long time. The fight record isn't who he is. It's what was done to him. She paused. He shows zero predatory response toward the child. Zero. What he shows is attachment behavior, protective positioning, proximity seeking. She closed her notes. Whatever that boy did to reach him, it worked. And it's not reversible. Zevran looked at Brutus. The dog was on the far side of the courtyard, sitting beside Kalian, who had been allowed to stay for the final session at Dr. Achebe's request. Kalian was showing Brutus something. A small flat stone, turning it over in his fingers, letting the dog sniff it. The dog was watching the stone with enormous focused attention. "He's not a liability," Dr. Achebe said. "He's a resolved one." She stood, picked up her case. "The only thing that dog is going to do in this house is follow that child around and refuse to let anything near him." She left. Zevran sat in the courtyard for a while after. He watched Kalian set the stone on the ground and then tap the spot beside it. Brutus sniffed the spot. Then Kalian picked the stone back up and held it out toward Brutus' nose. The dog touched it with the tip of his nose gently, like he was confirming something. It was a game, their own private system, built in a week and a half out of nothing, no shared language, no instruction, no training protocol. Just 2 people learning each other. Something moved in Zevran's chest that he was not prepared for. He thought about the monitoring data. About Cedric's careful face when he'd said he had no comparable data point. About Nairos standing in the hallway saying things that Nairos, cold, watchful, unreadable Nairos, had never said before. He thought about the last 3 weeks. The way Kalian's posture had changed at the dinner table. The way he'd started bringing a small whiteboard into rooms, nothing elaborate, just a way to write single words, short phrases, point at things. The way the staff had started actually reading it instead of waiting for one of the brothers to interpret. He thought about how long the boy had been in this house. 3 years. 3 years of security and space and structure and everything money could build around a child to keep them safe. And it had taken a dog nobody wanted. A scarred, used up, written off animal with a red termination tag, to give Kalian what the whole operation hadn't. To be chosen. That matters. Pause on that. To be chosen without condition. Without agenda. Without a risk assessment or a protocol or a line item in a security plan. Just chosen. Cedric found Zevran in the courtyard an hour later. He had a tablet under his arm with updated arrangements. A proper veterinary plan, behavioral support, structural modifications to 2 rooms in the East Wing to better accommodate Brutus' presence. He'd stayed up most of the night building the plan. Because that was what Cedric did when something entered the estate's ecosystem. He handed Zevran the tablet. Zevran looked at it, then looked at his brother. You notice anything different about Kalian this week? Cedric looked out at the courtyard, where Kalian had now graduated to walking slowly in a wide circle with Brutus trotting at his left side, matching his pace with an attention that would have embarrassed most trained dogs. Cedric was quiet for a moment. His door has been open, he said finally. Zevran looked at him. He used to keep it closed. Every night. Cedric kept his eyes on the courtyard. It's been open every night since the dog came. Both nights. The monitor shows him sleeping. He paused. All the way through. They stood together watching their youngest brother walk his circle. Brutus never left his side. Not even by a step. 6 weeks later, the Vire estate felt different. Not in any way that would show up in a security report or a floor plan. The cameras were in the same places. The staff was the same. The locked rooms were still locked. The operations that ran through the estate's infrastructure kept running the way operations did. Underneath, invisible, continuous. But the air was different, lighter somehow, or maybe warmer. Or maybe what changed was something about the way people moved through the rooms, with slightly less deliberateness, slightly less weight. Zevran had installed a private tutor for Kalian. Not a new one, Kalian had always had tutors. But this one was different, chosen specifically for her background in nonverbal communication and alternative language development. She came 3 days a week. She sat on the floor. She brought materials that didn't assume speech was the goal, that assumed communication was the goal, which is a different thing entirely. Kalian took to it like he'd been waiting. His whiteboard, which had started as a single small rectangle, had expanded. He had 3 now, different sizes for different situations. The small one for quick communication in passing. The medium one for conversations. The large one, mounted on the wall of his room, for things he wanted to say that required more space. The large one had drawings on it. A lot of drawings. Brutus featured prominently. Cedric had modified the East Wing security protocol, not weakened it, adjusted it. Fewer motion sensors in the interior spaces, which had been triggering on the dog and creating constant low-level alerts. Better lighting in the corridor that connected Kalian's room to the courtyard, because Kalian had been taking Brutus out early in the mornings and the previous lighting had been designed for security, not for a child and a dog navigating the space before sunrise. Small changes, practical ones, but they added up to something. The estate was learning how to hold someone it had never quite known how to hold before. Nairos watched all of it. He had always been the observer. It was his role, his nature, The thing that had made him effective in every context the Vire operation required effectiveness in. He watched people the way you watch weather, tracking patterns, noting changes, filing the information away for later use. He was watching Kalian differently now. Not for information, not for assessment, for the thing he'd started to understand slowly, since the night he'd stood in that corridor and asked a question nobody could answer. Why him? He was starting to understand the answer. Not because it had been explained to him. Nobody had explained it. There was nothing to explain. It wasn't a logic problem. It was simpler than that and harder. Kalian saw things other people couldn't see, or wouldn't see, or had trained themselves not to see because seeing things meant feeling them, and feeling them complicated the clean machinery of how the Vire household ran. He had walked into an underground facility nobody had told him about, found a cage nobody was looking at, and recognized, in a dog the system had labeled disposable, something worth fighting for. Without a voice, without a plan, without a single person in the entire building who took him seriously. And he had been right. Nairos stood in the doorway of Kalian's room on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the night in the corridor. The lights were low. Kalian was on his bed, lying on his back, one arm behind his head, the other resting on Brutus, who was stretched out beside him, taking up most of the available bed space with the total lack of self-consciousness that large dogs achieve when they've decided somewhere is theirs. Kalian was awake, staring at the ceiling. His expression was the loosest Nairos had ever seen it, relaxed in a way that looked almost strange on a face that had always carried something tightened inside it. Brutus opened one eye, looked at Nairos, closed it again. Kalian turned his head, saw Nairos in the doorway, didn't startle, didn't close his expression, just looked at him with those wide, surface-level eyes, the ones that held everything. He lifted one hand, a small wave, casual, easy, like it was nothing, like Nairos standing in his doorway was normal, like this house was a place where that could just happen. Nairos stayed in the doorway another moment. Then he nodded, once, slow, and walked away. In the hallway, he stopped and stood there for a second, one hand resting against the wall. Not for support, just resting there. From inside the room, nothing. No sound. Kalian didn't make sound. But from the room, Nairos could hear Brutus shift. The soft thud of the dog resettling his weight. The creak of the bed. And then quiet. The kind of quiet that was different from silence. The kind that meant something was complete. Sometimes the ones we think need saving are the ones saving us. Nairos didn't say it out loud, but he thought it the way you think things that land too accurately to ignore. He thought about the red tag, about Gerald's schedule, about a boy with no voice slamming his hands against bars in a facility full of people who had learned not to look. He thought about the moment Brutus chose to sit, and he understood, finally, the thing he'd been turning over since that night. Brutus hadn't chosen Kalian because Kalian was powerful, or protected, or safe. He'd chosen him because Kalian was the only one in that building who had actually looked at him, really looked, without an agenda, without a category, without a red tag already in hand, just looked. And Nairos, who had spent 20 years being the man in the room who saw everything, stood in the hallway of his own estate and understood, for the first time, that there was a difference between watching and seeing. The difference had been there the whole time. He just hadn't looked close enough. But what no one in the Vire estate had figured out yet was why that facility had Brutus in the first place, who had put him there, and whether the choice Brutus made that night, to sit beside one specific silent boy in a room full of armed men, was the first time it had happened. Or not. If the story moved you, drop a comment below. Tell me, when was the last time someone truly saw you? Not your title, not your role. You. This channel exists for stories like this one. Stories about the ones who are told they don't matter until they change everything. If that's the kind of content you want more of, Subscribe right now and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is built to stay with you. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it, and we will see you in the next chapter.